Hi, everybody. Erev Shabbat Shalom. I hope that everyone enjoyed their Yom Ha'atzmaut, and whether we were here in Israel or in Chul. And now it's going to be quiet for a while, which is the only thing that's on the way till Shavuot or Lag Bomer and Yom Yerushalayim, so that have some sort of normalcy, some sort of like a regular. A regular schedule. Okay, so this week we have a double Parsha, Tazria-Metzora, which raises really some of the more difficult, especially for us moderns, difficult concepts for us to understand or to identify with, or to, I think the expression is wrap your head around. I don't really like that expression, but I understand that it's very popular nowadays. It's hard to keep up with, it's actually hard to keep up with spoken English, even though I follow things in the States. One of the things I discovered not long ago was the fact that I'm able to do the New York Times crossword puzzle books up till 1993, which is when I left America. And if I tried today, there's no way I would be able to do it. Anyways, the challenge that's involved in these two Parshiot and some of the Parshiot that are coming up is the fact that they center upon the question of Tumah and Tahara, usually translated as impurity and purity, uncleanness and cleanness, which none of them are good, because they imply a moral overtone. So, and while it is true, some bad things can generate and can create a situation of Tumah, which require purification. There's no real moral issue. There's no prohibition against being Tameh. You're not a bad person if you're Tameh. It's a situation. It's a halachic category in which you find yourself. So that I'm going to use purity and impurity for the simple reason that that's what we say. But it's really very bad, very bad translation. In any event, as opposed to other things in the Torah, purity and purity, Tumah and Tahara are not things that we really understand. They're not part of our daily lives. And when we read about them, we have a tendency to I won't say not to take them seriously, but I would say to sort of put distance between ourselves and Tumah and Tahara, to sort of raise our eyebrows and say, well, that was then, this is primitive. I've heard not a few of my confreres in the Jewish community, and not necessarily Orthodox Jews, all kinds of Jews, Orthodox Jews included, say, well, we had, it's like I sort of take up my Manidian position, that, unsophisticated ancient people needed taboos, and this is all taboos, and we have to get past the taboos, and to get all Freudian, and so on. I think that's disrespectful. It might be an element of taboo. Who says taboo is not sophisticated? It might be inconvenient, but it doesn't mean it's not sophisticated. In fact, two powerful, very widely admired world religions have Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity, at the center of their religious lives. At least. One is Islam, and the other one is Hinduism. And Shiite Islam is even more strict, is even more, puts questions of purity and purity at the center of their religious lives far more than the Sunnah does. So I don't think that anybody who would today in the West sit there and look down their noses at either Hinduism or Islam and say, well, they're a bunch of primitives, what do they know? We're so much smarter. If these categories can be meaningful there, then perhaps we should give our own tradition an opportunity to speak and see what really is involved in the questions of Tumah and Tahara. Furthermore, even for us you have to realize that in Judaism, Tumah v'Tahara played a central formative role in the organization of Jewish life from the time of the Bible, certainly through the destruction of the Second Temple in 70, but what many, many people don't know, all the way down to the pre-modern era in certain areas. Now, it wasn't always possible to maintain a regimen of always being tahor because of the disappearance of the ashes of the last red heifer, but these only disappeared in the 4th century, and we know for a fact that Jews continued to live their lives b'tahara, voluntarily, at least until then, and there were literary indications that, in fact, at least in France and Germany in the Middle Ages up until the 14th century, at least, people tried their best to continue to follow the rules of Tumah as far as make sure that your food is tahor, to make sure that you're tahor, all kinds of stuff. So there's a rule in the history of law, and certainly the history of customs, that if customs are not binding, as the laws of Tumah v'Tahara are not in Chutz La'aretz, generally speaking, and in fact the rules of marital purity, nidah, are not it's most likely, of course it's always an argument among Rishonim, right, are most likely have nothing to do with Tumah v'Tahara. They have to do with questions of things that are allowed and not allowed, of what's called Isur v'Heter. There is no being a nidah or being a yoledet, having a menstrual period or having a baby is not a moral state. It's an objective halachic state with ramifications, but it's not a question of good or bad. It just is. In any event, you don't follow a regimen if it's not meaningful. Customs, not millions, hundreds, thousands of customs, tens of thousands of customs have disappeared over the years because they no longer spoke to people. Once we used to do this, and once we used to do that. And why did people stop doing it? Because they no longer meant anything to anyone. So you stopped. The fact that there was this ongoing effort to keep the rules of Tumah v'Tahara, including food, requires that we ask ourselves, whoa, maybe there's something to it. What maybe it means? It obviously meant something experientially and religiously to a lot of people. So, I'm not going to try here in our brief encounter to try to explain to you, to try to come up with a whole gun theory in terms of all the various forms of Tumah v'Tahara. I would like to give you just one idea that is pertinent to this week's double parsha. But before I do that, I should quickly tell you what the lay of the land is. There are at least three major explanations for Tumah v'Tahara, and why a person becomes tamei by contact with a dead body, by contact with a dead rodent, by having tzara'at, by all the by having a whether it's a sexual or non-sexual ejaculation, or whatever the case might be. I'm not going to try to find one big reason personally, but I will tell you the general trends that have a reason. Okay, one, which goes back to the rabbis, is that Tumah is something physical. It's like a physico-spiritual. There's a physico-spiritual disease or state of being where you are affected by bad powers, Kabbalists like this, by bad powers, and you need to be rid of them. The way that the Torah lets you be rid of them is by going through a process of purification, which always results in going to the mikveh. Okay. Interestingly, one of the people who is the most emphatic about this line of analysis is Rabbi Dr. Ovadia Sforno, who was a physician. He was I think he was the first Jew to graduate from the University of Bologna in the late 15th, early 16th century. In the 16th century, sorry. He was a tremendously sophisticated individual. He published his major philosophical work, which is called Or Amim, and is translated. He published simultaneously the English and the English, not the English, the Hebrew and the Latin Lux Gentium at the same time. And yet he says that's what happens. That forces affect you, and you have to get rid of them, and so on. That's a very physical kind of approach to Tahara. Maybe it is appropriate for a doctor. Maimonides and most of the Spanish, not Mizrahi, but Spanish and authorities and Provençal authorities, they know the opposite. They say, no, it's a spiritual idea. That there's no physical effect. Tumah Tahara has no physical effect on the person. The Torah says do it this way, and the Torah says do it that way, and you have to try to figure out what kind of effect that has on you. But it is not a physical thing. It's totally conceptual. It's very attenuated in terms of your experience thereof. I would like to suggest something in the middle, which is based on an insight which I had a number of years ago, specifically in the context of the issues raised in this week's double session. I would like to suggest that Tumah is certainly not a physical, in the sense of being like an infection. It's not corona. But I don't think it's so attenuated or rarefied as so abstract and inaccessible, so intellectualized as Maimonides would have it. I would like to suggest that indeed Tumah is a religious reality which can be felt, is supposed to be felt, both spiritually, psychologically, not just both, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. We have a tendency to over-intellectualize. I don't know, it's because of an intimacy problem that is true of modern man, I'm not sure. But we certainly have a tendency to take things which are uncomfortable and to try to make them abstractions so that we don't feel them and we don't feel ill at ease. And that's unfortunate, because I think that Judaism, as opposed to Christianity, as opposed to other religions, does not make a sharp and unbridgeable distinction between the physical and the spiritual. We can feel the spiritual physically, and we can feel the physical spiritually. I will give you an example. One of the central sources of Tumah in this double sedra is tsarat. Tsarat is usually translated as leprosy. That's not true, because that would mean that it's Hansen's disease, which is not what the Torah had in mind. It's not described in the same way. I mean, whatever tsarat is, it's not leprosy, but it's a serious physical ailment. Okay, the rabbis have said, and this is very famous, Metzora, they do what's called a Midrash Shemot. They interpret the word and say that it really stands for Motzi Shem Ra, a person who gossips, a person who tale bears, a person who passes illegitimately passes information on about somebody else. And they'll already tell little kids in school that if you go and tell talebear and you're an inveterate gossip, you will be, that's the punishment. One of the striking things about tsarat in the Torah is that it affects not just a person; it affects clothing, it affects one's house. It's a very strange form of impurity, where most of the sources of impurity come from living in contact with living beings, or living beings that once were living beings. Rav Yehuda Levi already pointed out that most of them have some kind of a death nexus, and the Tumah Tahara is part of the life-death nexus, passing from encounter with death to encounter with life. So Tzarat is unique in that regard. And the question is why? So I'd like to see us the following based on a story that really happened to me. Many years ago, I was walking out on Shabbat afternoon with my wife, and we met a person who was known in the neighborhood as a inveterate gossip. And said Shabbat Shalom, and then I made the mistake of asking, what's new? I don't know what I was thinking. I should have realized with whom I was dealing. And that person began to open up and just flood us with unsolicited information, some of it very intimate, about all kinds of people in the neighborhood. And my wife and I tried to desperately get away from this person, and they followed us. And finally we got away. But all the time, there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And when we got into the house, I said to my wife, I need a shower. I really feel like I need a shower. And it was at that point that it hit me. That's Tumah Tzara. What had happened? This person had violated the persona of the people of which they were discussing. Had violated their had hurt them without them even being able to defend themselves. Had enveloped us in all this information. And those are the two of the three sides of talebearing. The person who tells, the person who accepts. And being in a situation of such violation of privacy and secrecy, and exposing someone else, and harming someone else, because at the end of the day, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen, the Chavetz Chaim, in his book about Lashon Hara, says that the bottom line in terms of why you shouldn't talebear is because why you shouldn't gossip is you're hurting somebody, especially since they're not there to defend themselves. And with personal privacy is their dignity. What else do you have? What else do you have in your life except for your dignity, your good name, and your relationship with God? Those are the things nobody can take away from you. I realized that I experienced this encounter both spiritually, psychologically, emotionally on the one hand, and physically. So I said, you know what? And I felt dirty. Or I felt I needed to be cleansed. I wasn't dirty. I wasn't physically dirty. But I felt it physically. I think we've all had situations like that. So that Tumah, from that angle, is an expression of the fact that when you encounter something, certain encounters affect you on every level of your being. And you're supposed to allow yourself to be affected thereby. It strengthens, it empowers that encounter. Certainly it's true if you come encounter a dead body, you go to a funeral, because that puts forward before you your own mortality. Your own mortality is a function of your soul and your body. What's more obvious than that? And the Torah, by setting forth this entire system of Tumah v'Tahara, says it admonishes us to try as much as possible to live b'Tahara. It's avoiding this kind of situation is impossible. But once you experience them, and you experience them totally, the result will be that you'll yearn to be tahor. You'll learn to rebirth, if you wish, going through the mikveh, whatever the case might be, and to avoid or to appreciate the situations which are not involved in Tumah, whether it's a matter of sin. It's an old custom, if you sin, to go to mikveh. There's a reason for that. Not because it physically makes you ill, but your body feels as much as your soul does that you've done something wrong. That's where the custom of going to mikveh before Yom Kippur comes from. And if it's true that Tumah is always a form of death, or evokes death, and Tahara is life, no way of avoiding death. But once you encounter it, to cling to life, that I think is says a lot about what this whole thing is about. And it explains why it is not an anachronistic taboo from some ancient cult, but an integrative and sophisticated approach to an existential situation which faces us all the time. Shabbat Shalom.